I'd like to address a question today for a few minutes. What are we doing when we recite the Shema? What are we doing? What are we accomplishing by reciting the Shema? If you think about it, it's actually a very odd text. It's the central text, or one of the two central texts of Jewish liturgy, of Jewish worship. And yet it is actually, it's not a prayer. We're not talking to God when we recite the Shema. And it's not it's not a song of praise, a hymn. We're not talking about God. In fact, the Shema is addressed to us. The opening words, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, listen, O Israel, are speaking to us. So why are we reciting a text in the middle of our prayers that is not in fact a prayer? And we also might wonder, why these three paragraphs? If you were going to choose three paragraphs from the Torah to state the central liturgical, to make the central liturgical statement of the Jewish people, if you were going to choose three paragraphs or just a few snippets, that would be the main thing that you're supposed to say before you die, would you have chosen these three paragraphs? Why these three paragraphs? To answer these questions, I'd like to leave the Shema. I'd like to leave the Siddur for a few minutes. I'd like to leave the Bible for a little while and leave Durham. I'd like us to go to the Hittite Empire. So I'd like us to go back in time to the Middle and Late Bronze Age. I'd like us to go north of the land of Israel to what is today Turkey. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the Hittite Empire. Seems like a strange connection, but stay with me here. The Hittites had a particular kind of empire. You might say that empires come in two flavors. There are the empires like the British Empire, who conquer an area and then rule it directly. They own it. They send a governor from London to be the governor of North Carolina, or to be the governor of the colony of New Jersey, or to be the governor general of India. That's one kind of empire. Then there's another kind of empire, the Soviet sort of empire, where there are nominally independent states like Poland or Hungary or East Germany who have their own government, have their own army, but not really. Those independent states are subject to the control of the imperial center in Moscow. The Hittite Empire was a Soviet-style empire, not a British-style empire. And the relationship between the imperial center in the capital of the Hittites in what is today Turkey and the various local kingdoms in the Near East, in the Fertile Crescent, that relationship was spelled out in a legal document between the Hittite emperor and a local king. The king of this little city-state in what is today Syria, or that little city-state in what is today northern Iraq. This relationship between the emperor and the local king was spelled out in a particular kind of document. Archaeologists uncovered a whole set of these treaties, digging up the capital of the Hittites well over 100 years ago. The Hittite documents were deciphered, and these treaties, among other texts, were studied. And people realize that these treaties, as is often the case with legal documents, they tend to follow a pattern. They use formulaic language, and they have the same structural elements. So if everyone can look at the handout, the first page of the handout. If anyone doesn't have the handout, maybe raise your hand. I don't know if we've got any more. So on the first page of this handout, I lay out the different elements that show up in all of these treaties. Of these 8 elements, 7 or 8 of these elements will appear somewhere or another in the treaties. So just let's look through what these elements are. The treaties often begin with the emperor identifying himself and speaking directly to the local king, the vassal king. So the emperor, the overlord, the suzerain, will say, I am Wersilis, the king of the Hittites, the great one, the sun. It'll go on with a bunch of titles. And then it will address the local king, the king of the little cities in Syria or Iraq or wherever it happens to be. It'll address that king as you. So element number 1 is self-identification. There is also what we could call a historical prologue in which the emperor explains to the local king why the local king owes him loyalty. So he might say, when your grandfather was on the throne and the Assyrians invaded, my father, who was the emperor of the Hittites then, sent his army to rescue you and restore you to your throne. Or when your general led a coup against you and you had to flee your city, I brought my army and I punished the general and I restored you to the throne. It's an explanation of why the lower ranking party, the vassal, owes loyalty to the suzerain, to the Hittite emperor. Number 3 are the stipulations. This is the heart of the treaty. These are a listing of what the lower ranking party, the vassal, owes to the emperor. He owes taxes, he owes loyalty. Very importantly, he owes military loyalty. He's got to send his army to fight on behalf of the Hittites whenever the Hittite emperor says so. And some of these treaties specify that, as part of the stipulations, you're not allowed to have this kind of relationship with any other king. I am your only overlord. If you were, the Polish government in the 1950s and 60s, you weren't allowed to join the Warsaw Pact and also NATO. You could only be loyal to Moscow. Same idea here. Number 4, most of these treaties have a section saying that the treaty document, the actual clay tablet, has to be deposited in the vassal kingdom at some safe and sacred place. Usually it's deposited in a temple. So you've got to put the document, the actual physical document, somewhere special. Number 5, the document has to be read out loud to the king. The local king, the vassal king, has staff members who read for him. Kings don't usually know how to read themselves, but they have staff who do that. And that staff member, the scribe, has to recite this out loud, maybe 3 times a year, once a year, whatever it happens to be. Number 6, we get a list of witnesses to the treaty. This is a legal document, so there have to be witnesses. The witnesses are the gods of the 2 different nations. Number 7, there is a statement of the blessings that will come upon the vassal king if the vassal king obeys this treaty, is loyal to the Hittite emperor. And number 8, there's a listing of the curses, the terrible things that should come upon the vassal king and his kingdom if he is disloyal to the Hittite emperor. So, as I said, over a century ago, scholars, especially in Germany, had deciphered these texts, had noted that these treaties have these particular 8 elements. And then in 1954, a professor from the University of Michigan, any Michigan grads here? Michigan grads? So a professor, George Mendenhall at the University of Michigan, wrote one of the most influential articles in the history of modern Bible scholarship, in which he pointed out that the elements of the Hittite overlord vassal treaties show up again and again and again in the Bible, especially in parts of the Bible that describe the creation of a relationship between God and the nation Israel. So if you start with the story of the giving of the Torah, the story of Matan Torah in the book of Exodus chapter 19, and you read all the way to the end of the book of Leviticus, at which point the Israelites are still encamped at the foot of Mount Sinai, you actually will find almost all of these elements showing up somewhere in that textual block that deals with what happened at Mount Sinai where the Torah was given. When you go to the book of Deuteronomy, there again, you'll see most of these elements showing up somewhere in the book of Deuteronomy. If you go to the book of Joshua, chapter 24, you'll see that most of these elements show up somewhere or another. What I'd like to point out today is that the same is actually true not only of the whole book of Deuteronomy or the whole story of what happened at Sinai from Exodus 19 to Leviticus 26, but these elements actually all show up in the Shema with maybe one exception, and the one exception isn't surprising. So let's just go through this. If anyone wants to, you can open up your Siddur to the Shema. Anyone happen to remember what page the Shema is on?
Page 155.
So if you'd like, you can go to page 155, and let's just think about where do we see these elements in the 3 paragraphs of the Shema. So the self-identification in which the overlord says to the vassal, this is who I am so-and-so. Where do you get that in the Shema? Well, to some extent, the first line, it gives us the name and the role. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu. Listen, O Israel, Hashem is our God, but that's not first person language. Where do we get the first person, I am the Lord your God? At the very end, Ani Adonai Elohechem, almost at the very, very end of the third paragraph of the Shema, and that is followed immediately by what element? I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. That, in other words, is the historical prologue. Why does the Jewish people owe loyalty to God? Because God rescued us from slavery in Egypt. So elements numbers 1 and 2 come at the very end of the Shema. We're getting them both there. Stipulations, commandments that we're supposed to observe. Where do we get that? Well, everything. All three paragraphs. They're full of various mitzvot. So we've got plenty of stipulations. Among the specific stipulations is that the vassal, we Israelites, we Jews, cannot have any other overlord. Where do we get that spelled out explicitly in the Shema? For one thing, it's implied in Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. There's only one God. We can only have this relationship with God. I think it's implied there. That's the way we usually understand that line. But I think it's even a little bit more explicit in the second paragraph. Where in the second paragraph do we get this idea? Well, actually, the third paragraph we get it there as well. But in the second paragraph, we get it with Hishamaru lachem pen yiftel lachem v'sartem v'avadotem Elohim acherim. Watch out, don't allow yourself to go astray by worshiping other gods. So quite specifically in the middle of the second paragraph, and also in Lo Taturu, don't let yourself go astray. In the third paragraph, we've got this idea that we can't have any other overlord. That is to say, we're not allowed to worship any other gods or goddesses. Deposition of the treaty document in a safe or sacred place, number 4. Where do we get this in the Shema? Where are we told that the treaty document, or maybe some snippets from, some representative selections from the treaty document, have to be put somewhere special? Where in the first paragraph? Put them on the doorposts of your house. So the commandment of mezuzah, both in the first and also at the end of the second paragraph, that's the deposition. We've got to put them right over there, the doorpost of our house. And they also need to be deposited somewhere else. Tefillin. We're supposed to put them on our hearts and on our heads, which is at least understood by the rabbis to be a reference to the mitzvah of tefillin. We take a little snippet, a few selections of the treaty document of the Torah, put them in a small box, and then we bind those boxes to our arm and to our head. So deposition of the document in a special place, our homes and in our homes and on our bodies, is showing up in the Shema. Periodic reading aloud to the vassal. In the Hittite treaties, this would happen a few times a year. In the book of Deuteronomy, at the end of Deuteronomy chapter 31, we're told that the entire Jewish people has to gather every 7 years and hear the book of Deuteronomy being chanted out loud. So we get that in the Hittite documents, we get that in the Torah, but where do we get it in the Shema? Periodic recitation of a bit of the treaty document. Vishinantam levanecha, you should repeat them to your children, and then especially v'dibarta bam b'shivtecha b'veitecha u'v'lechtecha v'derech u'v'shoftecha u'kmecha. You should say some of these. V'dibarta bam. Say some of this, whether you're at home or away, every evening and every morning. So the periodic recitation occurs not once a year, not 3 times a year, not once every 7 years, as is the case in the book of Deuteronomy, but the periodic recitation occurs twice a day. This element in particular, by the way, I think is especially interesting. In the Hittite treaties, you've got a king who doesn't know how to read, and you've got a staff member, a scribe working for the king, who has the responsibility of reciting it out loud to the king on some regular basis. What's interesting about the Shema is that the Shema and the book of Deuteronomy, they put us Israelites, us Jews, into both roles. We are both the king and the scribe. We have to recite it out loud. So each of us twice a day has to act like a learned scribe by reciting this out loud, but we're also the king because we're the person to whom it's being recited. That is why it's important in the halacha to recite the Shema out loud. You're not supposed to say your daily Shema quietly. You've got to say it loud enough that you can actually hear yourself saying it. because your mouth is in the role of the scribe and your ear is in the role of the king. When we realize, by the way, that in the ancient world, of course, very, very few people knew how to read, scribal training was a very rare elite status. When you realize that the book of Deuteronomy requires every single Israelite to be a little bit of a scribe, even if you don't know how to read, you've got to memorize these paragraphs and say a little bit of this out loud to yourself every day. The book of Deuteronomy requires every Jew to be a little bit learned. And that actually, I think, describes an enormous amount of Jewish culture through the ages, the fact that we're all required to be scribes, and we're also all required to be kings. We're also given the status of kings. We're the one to whom this treaty document is being recited. So we get the periodic reading out loud. The list of witnesses, that we don't get in the Shema, but why is that not important? Why is that not surprising? Why is this the one element that has to be missing? I'm sorry? It's not that we're the witness. There are no witnesses listed, period. It's a legal document that doesn't have any witnesses because the witnesses are other gods. This is the element from the Hittite treaties that can't be absorbed easily into the tradition. And so it's missing in Exodus through Leviticus when we go through these elements. And I think it's probably also missing in the Shema. There may be, and this is maybe a stretch, but maybe there's a little echo of the witness theme, though. Where might we get a little bit of an echo of a witness theme when we look at the Shema in a Torah scroll or in many Sidurim? Exactly. The ayin and the dalet in the first line, the ayin, the letter ayin of the word Shema, and the dalet of the word echad in the first line of the Shema are written in bigger letters. Just looking at those two, you could get the word aid, which means witness. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but maybe this is a little kind of nod in the direction of that theme. Blessings and curses. Where do we get the blessings and curses that follow from obedience or disobedience? Second paragraph. That's the entire reason for the second paragraph. That's the topic of the second paragraph. First the witnesses, and then first the blessings, then the curses. So it turns out when you look at the Shema in light of late Bronze Age Near Eastern culture, that the Shema, it's not a prayer. The Shema is a contract. The Shema is a treaty document. It's a statement of a brit, or what's called sometimes in Hebrew, an edut. It's a statement of a contract between the overlord, God, and the vassal, which is the entire Jewish people. What we're doing when we recite the Shema is we are signing a contract. Essentially, we're signing a contract by reciting this every morning and every evening to ourselves. We are agreeing to accept God's sovereignty, and we're agreeing to accept God's and obey God's commandments. In fact, this interpretation that the purpose of the Shema is to accept God as our overlord and to accept God's commandments is found actually in the Mishnah. If you go to the bottom of page 2 on the handout, there's a famous passage in the Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha, Lama Kadma Shema V'haya im Shamoa. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha said, why does the paragraph that begins Shema Yisrael precede the one that begins V'haya im Shamoa? In other words, why does the first paragraph come first? Ele chedei sheyikabel alav ol malchut shamayim tchila v'achar kach yikabel alav ol mitzvot. It's because one first accepts upon oneself the yoke of divine kingship, and then one accepts upon oneself the yoke of the commandments. It's a very, very well-known interpretation of the Shema, but when you read the first paragraph of the Shema, you might wonder, why do they think that the Shema is about God as king? The word melech, the word mamlacha, malchut, none of these words appear, none of the words associated with kingship seem to appear in the first paragraph, or actually any paragraph of the Shema. Why does Yehoshua ben Korcha just assume that this is the meaning of the Shema, that the Shema is a statement that we accept God's kingship and also God's commandments? When you just read the Mishnah by itself, it's a little bit odd, but when you read the Shema in the context of the ancient Near East, you realize that Yehoshua ben Korcha gets it right. Yehoshua ben Korcha had simply received an interpretive tradition that went back to a time long before the rabbis that said that these paragraphs together somehow come together to make a statement of a contract in which we're agreeing that God is our overlord and that we'll obey God's commandments. I don't think that Yehoshua ben Korcha had any way of knowing why that was the case. He didn't know about the Hittites. They had been long, long forgotten by then. But what the Mishnah is telling us is the purpose of the Shema. We realize that yes, that really is historically the purpose of the Shema. That's why some group of people before the rabbinic period, in all likelihood, chose these three paragraphs to be the central statement of Jewish liturgy. So I hope that from here on out, when you're saying the Shema every evening and every morning, you do so with a little bit more awareness of what you're accomplishing by saying these words, by reciting these particular paragraphs. We're renewing our covenant every single day with God. I think it's actually really quite extraordinary to realize that, here in Durham, North Carolina, or for me, most days up in Teaneck, New Jersey, or wherever it happens to be, we are living out a living piece of late Bronze Age culture. The Shema is an extraordinary testament to the long trajectory and continuity of the Jewish people's relationship with God that came from a particular time and a particular place that we reenact on a daily basis. Toda rabah, Shabbat Shalom.